Good morning. On behalf of the Vietnam Film Club, we are here to do a very special segment for our upcoming documentary film, My South Vietnam. Being with us today is a very special guest. In a couple seconds, I will introduce him. But before that, I would like to introduce the projects and the vision or the missions of Vietnam Film Club. Vietnam Film Club was established and founded by two members, Dr. Nguyễn Ngọc Bích and Mr. CHIπαιum N. Their focus was to bring to us the areas of very wide scope of education, history, culture, oral history, everything that has to do with Vietnam, the Vietnamese people, and the Vietnamese history. Being here with us in the studio today is Mr. Uwe Siemon-Netto. He is a journalist that had been in the Vietnam War himself. He is a very true witness of the war. And for him to be here with us today, he's going to present and talk about his experience, his being during the Vietnam War. You already had a book published, and the name of the book is Triumph of Absolutes, correct? Can we have the cover? Can you present us the book? And that is the book that he has established. What is that book about? And what we want to know about his experience is the upcoming interview. We thank you for listening and following through with us. So the very first question, Mr. Siemon, is that in your career as a journalist, especially a journalist in Vietnam.
Well, yes, I've been a journalist now for 65 years.
Wow.
But I started out in Germany. I worked, actually in Germany, I worked for the Associated Press, the American Wire Service.
Yes,
and the last story I covered in Germany was the construction of the Berlin Wall. You see, and this is why I obviously had a particular interest in East-West affairs, which extended obviously to Vietnam as well. Then I was transferred to England and then to America for the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when Khrushchev, the Soviet Union, planted nuclear missiles in Cuba. So I covered that. I covered the Kennedy assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, and the trial of Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was the guy who murdered Lee Harvey Oswald, who murdered Kennedy. Then pretty soon thereafter, Vietnam began to cook up as a major topic in the East-West debate or the Cold War. And Vietnam became, that is my view of the Vietnam War, the hot extension of the Cold War between East and West, between communism and democracy. So I went to Vietnam, fell in love with the country, and on and off I spent 5 years. And I wasn't one of those journalists who always spent the war years in Saigon bars. I actually went into combat. And most important story I covered in Vietnam, and that is where this photograph here was taken, was during Tet Mau Chan in 1968 in Hue. Okay, well, we can discuss that later, of course. And then, of course, I had others. I covered the Middle East wars. I covered all sorts of things. Then I was, for a while, I was managing editor of a newspaper in Germany. Then I came back, and later, because of my impressions, at least my impressions of war, I much later studied theology and did a master's degree in theology, where I wrote a theology of for Vietnam veterans called The Acquittal of God, and then I did my doctorate in theology at Boston University. No, I tell you what the most important. I mean, I studied. If I weren't a practicing Christian, I obviously wouldn't have bothered to study theology. It's a difficult topic to study.
Right.
But the main thing is being a journalist and being a theologian. If you do your stuff right, is in both cases you have to be curious. And my main problem with the breed of journalists that came out of the Vietnam War was that they no longer were curious. They wanted to tell people how to vote and how to think instead of just reporting. Well, theology is the same. You wouldn't study theology unless you were not curious about that.
It requires curiosity for both fields.
Well, both things. I mean, again, you wouldn't be a journalist if you couldn't write.
Right.
Or if you couldn't write fast, or couldn't research.
Mm-hmm.
And you wouldn't become a theologian unless you could think in philosophical, theological terms,
Right.
and unless you took it seriously. I take theology very seriously, and I'm an adamant theologian.
Mm-hmm.
That is probably, I'm probably the only Vietnam War correspondent to my knowledge who later became a theologian.
In each of the page of the book, CHIòng
n, yeah.
you painted a picture of these pain that being suffered by the Vietnamese people, the trauma that they had gone through, and then you embrace the people.
Yes.
What prompted you?
Well, that is precisely the point. Now, there are two different approaches of journalism. The one, the type of journalism that I was trained in, which took an interest in the people, in this case the Vietnamese people. And if you take an interest in the people, obviously you are not identical to Germans or Americans. You want to study their history,
right,
and their culture. You want to study Confucianism. You want to study the background of Vietnamese communism. Why Vietnamese communism? I hope we're going to be able to discuss this today, because it's very important to understand what happened in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was not a freedom fighter. He said so himself. He wanted world revolution of the Marxist-Leninist cause. It's something totally different from being a nationalist fighting for the liberation of his country. And he said so himself. Ho Chi Minh said so himself. So then when you really want to understand, or we try to begin to understand a nation which is so entirely different from your own culture, in my case, European culture, then you have to get used to their mentality. You have to use their philosophy. You have to know something about Buddhism and of course all the religions that you have there, and therefore that's what you learn. And you have to learn, for example, that Ho Chi Minh was a co-founder of the French Communist Party in 1920, and that he was a KGB agent as of 1923. That's Soviet intelligence. This is not known, and most Americans didn't read this. I don't know. Now,
I want to ask you,
Yeah.
though, in your book and in your journey of being both the journalist and
Yeah.
also the theologist, killing is an act of self-defense in many different ways, but in America, the legal system depicts killing as an act of crime. It is a crime, but for the communists, they executed the killing and they think of that action as an execution of the government policy.
Now take two incidents, two particular things. Take, for example, the American war crimes in My Lai. You know, My Lai, when they slaughtered the village population.
Right.
That was not in the execution of American policy. It was a platoon and their platoon leader gone wild. Okay? And he had to be tried. Unfortunately, he was not acquitted, but I mean, he didn't get what he really deserved. What the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong did, for example, in Tet Mau Tan and in Hue, I stood in front of at the rim of a mass grave, full of bodies of women and children and old men, nobody of fighting age. And the mass grave was found because this was Tet, the highest holiday, everybody was beautifully manicured, and the women were buried, many of the women obviously were buried alive, and they tried to claw themselves out of the ground, and they found the fingertips sort of like asparagus coming up from the ground, you know, and then they collapsed and they died.
Right. So
slowly.
Right.
That is a war crime which was part of policy, because it was terrorist policy, or
if the American legal system think killing or those are a crime, but the communist government think of that as their...
No, they all do.
So why did the international media
not all
that,
international media. If you allow me to elaborate just a little bit on that.
Right.
There were two types of journalists, foreign correspondents. Those who actually bothered to, or took an interest in the Vietnamese people, and those who went into combat. And then there were others who covered it from the bars of Saigon and hotel lobbies. Only 30% of all Vietnam correspondents, American and foreign correspondents in Vietnam, went into combat. Only 30%, 70% never left Saigon. So they were filled with ideologies. This was the breakup of the American media system, where it was no longer required to do proper research. They already knew the answers. For example, when I told you about this mass grave, I was taken there by a friend of mine, Peter Brayshaw was his name. He was the Saigon bureau chief of the Washington Post. And as we arrived there, looked at the site, there was an American television team stalking around this grave. And Peter Brayshaw said, why don't you film this? And you know what these guys said? We're not here to cover anti-communist propaganda.
Wow.
Yeah? So
nobody actually...
It's a different profession.
I see.
You know? It's like a butcher becoming a baker or something, I don't know. Or a tailor. You cannot... so the Americans, yes, the Americans did commit stupid crimes. The Americans made very bad mistakes in Vietnam. If we have time, we'll discuss it. I believe, for example, the search and destroy policy was wrong, because they never provided security for the Vietnamese civilians. The British had very early, under Nguyen Xuan's days, the British had an advisor called Sir Robert Thompson, who had won the war in Malaya, similar war, and he said, you clear territory, you hold the territory, but provide security for the civilians and for their means of income, fields and stuff like that.
In your book, many times you repeated a quote from Phỏng Nguyen Giáp had said that the enemy does not possess the psychological and political wills to fight a long.
That's not the will, it's the system.
Right. So why did you think that? Could
Well,
you explain?
I tell you why he was right. If you have elections every 2 years, as they do in the United States, every 2 years, the people, first of all, the politicians are campaigning instead of making policies. I'm talking about the House of Representatives. The mood changes if the population is badly instructed. Take the Tet Offensive. Tet Offensive was won by the South Vietnamese and the Americans. There's no doubt about it. The Viet Cong infrastructure was destroyed, North Vietnamese infrastructure was destroyed in South Vietnam. Then came Walter Cronkite, much later than I, and said, this war is unwinnable, we have to negotiate a reasonable peace. No, he was wrong. By that time the war was won by your side, or by the American side. Bad journalism, influence of population. When Cronkite said this, President Lyndon Baines Johnson of the United States said, I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. In other words, I've lost the support of the average American in the Middle West and in the South.
During the Tet Offensive in Hue in 1968, the Western media exploited the devastation of the massacre, and one of the cameramen, like you mentioned earlier, he has said, we're not here to film the communist propaganda.
No.
But being that and having that said, has the Western media duplicated the communist propaganda?
In essence, not the Western media. I mean, I have to be very careful because I followed, even in Germany, the liberal newspapers, what you would call liberal here in this country, were on the side of South Vietnam in the West, in the United States. And the Washington Post, my friend Peter Beestra, was a liberal newspaper, but he saw the crime and wanted it reported. I mean, North Vietnamese or communist crime, Viet Cong crime. So there is this impression that all the Western media, whether television, was awful. And I must tell you, I don't watch American television anymore because I don't trust them anymore. I watch British, French, and German television here in the States because they're just horrible. They've forgotten. They've forgotten their way. They lost their way.
Right. Speaking of the military operation, the Western media reported mostly. It focused on the Allied forces.
Forces, I'm sorry?
The Allied forces, while the Army of the Republic of Vietnam were the main force who fought with fearless fighting spirit. Can you name, could you comment on the spirit of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or on these famous battlefields, and names of the commanders, if you remember any?
Yeah. I know, that is another thing, that is the provincialism of the American media. Now, for example, give you a good friend of mine was a good reporter, but he worked for the Minneapolis Tribune. Minneapolis Tribune covered all of Minnesota. So when he went into an operation, the first thing he had to write about is there somebody from Minnesota in this unit I'm accompanying here?
I see.
So, that rational or reasonable. As a German, I had to do this only twice or three times because there were some Germans in the United States Armed Forces. I did go out a great deal with Vietnamese units, and before the Americans came in wholesale and the huge units, I went out only with South Vietnamese forces. Or with special forces and Nung, the Nung tribesmen and Chinese tribesmen who were special forces. But it really depends. But the impression was, of course, that this was an American war. And again, the mistake was, I believe, but I mean, fight to the cows come home by that, that the Americans made a mistake in sending 500,000 men in there, totally ignoring the local culture and sensibilities. And for example, there was the Yadrang Valley offensive. It's the first encounter between North Vietnamese and American forces. Was the air cavalry division. They fought the mainland forces, then withdrew, and at night the villages and small towns belonged to the Viet Cong. And I came into a village.
Do you remember the name of that village?
What?
Do you remember the name of that village?
No, I don't have the name of that village. It was tiny, but it was. I think I flew into Quang Tri, and it was somewhere in my book.
Okay. Then you have to read your book, right?
Yeah, you have to read the book. And by the way, it's out in Vietnamese too. But it was a tiny village, and I was with special forces, with a special forces team, and we were called into this village. Mm-hmm. In the evening, an American unit had cleared out of the village, taking everybody, and then cleared out, and then the Viet Cong came at night and hanged the village chief and his wife and his entire family in a gruesome fashion, as a warning to the entire population of the village, saying, if you cooperate with the South Vietnamese government, because the village chief had been on the side of the South Vietnamese government, it was Nguyen Cao Ki in those days. How much can you get support from a village population if you don't stay with the villagers, if you don't provide the security at night, if you make sure that the Viet Cong stay out of there? And that was, the British advisory commission there, finally the Brits left. They said it's useless, the Americans don't want to listen to us. The British did this, and they made very clear, we are here, we protect you. This little village here, this little hamlet, we protect you. We don't leave you alone, okay? And it doesn't matter how many communists swing from tree to tree in the jungle, as long as they're not in your village killing your civilians, and as long as they don't prevent you from growing your rice. And that was the main issue, I think. And I have to tell you this, these liberal intellectuals, Mac George Bundy, all these people, Kennedy brought in and Johnson, they had no idea of warfare, they had no idea of Southeast Asia, they didn't know the difference between the Vietnamese and Chinese and Cambodian or Thai. But they had their ideas from their universities, I see. They used to be called eggheads. I know, that is another thing, that is the provincialism of the American media. Now, for example, give you a good friend of mine, was a good reporter, but he worked for the Minneapolis Tribune. Minneapolis Tribune covered all of Minnesota. So when he went into an operation, the first thing he had to write about is there somebody from Minnesota in this unit I'm accompanying here? I see. So that is reasonable. As a German, I had to do this only twice or three times because there were some Germans in the United States Armed Forces. I did go out a great deal with Vietnamese units. And before the Americans came in, wholesale, huge units, I went out only with South Vietnamese forces, or with special forces and Nung, the Nung tribesmen, the Chinese tribesmen, who were special forces. But it really depends. But the impression was, of course, that this was an American war. And again, the mistake was, I believe, but I mean, fight to the cows come home by that, that the Americans made a mistake in sending 500,000 men in there, totally ignoring the local culture and the sensibilities. And, for example, there was the Yadrang Valley offensive. It's the first encounter between North Vietnamese and American forces. Was the air cavalry division. They fought the mainline forces, then withdrew, and at night the villages and small towns belonged to the Viet Cong. And I came into a village.
Do you remember the name of that village?
What?
Do you remember the name of that village?
No, I don't have the name of that village. It was tiny, but it was, I think I flew into Quang Tri, and it was somewhere in my book.
Okay. But you have to read your book, right?
Yeah, you have to read the book. And by the way, it's out in Vietnamese too. But it was a tiny village, and I was with special forces, with a special forces team, and we were called into this village. Mm-hmm. In the evening, an American unit had cleared out of the village, taking everybody, and then cleared out, and then the Viet Cong came at night and hanged the village chief and his wife and his entire family in gruesome fashion, as a warning to the entire population of the village, saying, if you cooperate with the South Vietnamese government, because the village chief had been on the side of the South Vietnamese government, it was Nguyen Cao Ki in those days. How much can you get support from a village population if you don't stay with the villagers, if you don't provide the security at night, if you make sure that the Viet Cong stay out of there? And that was the British advisory commission. They had to provide. Finally, the Brits left. They said it's useless. The Americans don't want to listen to us. The British did this, and they made very clear, we are here, we protect you. This little village here, this little hamlet, we protect you. We don't leave you alone, okay? And it doesn't matter how many communists swing from tree to tree in the jungle, as long as they're not in your village killing your civilians, and as long as they don't prevent you from growing your rice. And that was the main issue, I think. And I have to tell you this, these liberal intellectuals, Mac George Bundy, all these people Kennedy brought in and Johnson, they had no idea of warfare, they had no idea of Southeast Asia, they didn't know the difference between a Vietnamese, a Chinese, a Cambodian, or a Thai. But they had their ideas from their universities,
I see.
They used to be called eggheads.
Speaking of the military operation, the Western media reported mostly, it focused on the Allied forces.
Forces, no, sorry?
The Allied forces, while the Army of the Republic of Vietnam were the main force who fought with fearless fighting spirit. Can you name, could you comment on the spirit of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or on these famous battlefields, and names of the commanders, if you remember any?
I know, that is another thing, that is the provincialism of the American media. Now, for example, give you a good friend of mine was a good reporter, but he worked for the Minneapolis Tribune. Minneapolis Tribune covered all of Minnesota. So when he went into an operation, the first thing he had to write about is there somebody from Minnesota in this unit I'm accompanying here?
I see.
So that is reasonable. As a German, I had to do this only twice or three times because there were some Germans in the United States Armed Forces. I did go out a great deal with Vietnamese units. And before the Americans came in, wholesale, huge units, I went out only with South Vietnamese forces, or with special forces and Nung, the Nung tribesmen, the Chinese tribesmen, who were special forces. But it really depends. But the impression was, of course, that this was an American war. And again, the mistake was, I believe, but I mean, fight to the cows come home by that, that the Americans made a mistake in sending 500,000 men in there, totally ignoring the local culture and the sensibilities. And, for example, there was the Yadrang Valley offensive. It's the first encounter between North American, North Vietnamese and American forces. Was the air cavalry division. They fought the mainline forces, then withdrew, and at night the villages and small towns belonged to the Viet Cong. And I came into a village.
Do you remember the name of that village?
What?
Do you remember the name of that village?
No, I don't have the name of that village. It was tiny, but it was, I think I flew into Quang Tri, and it was somewhere in my book.
Okay. But you have to read your book, right?
Yeah, you have to read the book. And by the way, it's out in Vietnamese too. But it was a tiny village, and I was with special forces, with a special forces team, and we were called into this village. Mm-hmm. In the evening, an American unit had cleared out of the village, taking everybody, and then cleared out, and then the Viet Cong came at night and hanged the village chief and his wife and his entire family in a gruesome fashion, as a warning to the entire population of the village, saying, if you cooperate with the South Vietnamese government, because the village chief had been on the side of the South Vietnamese government, it was Nguyen Cao Ki in those days, so how much can you get support from a village population if you don't stay with the villagers, if you don't provide the security at night, if you make sure that the Viet Cong stay out of there? And that was the British Advisory Commission. They had to provide. Finally, the Brits left. They said it's useless. The Americans don't want to listen to us. The British did this, and they made very clear, we're here, we protect you. This little village here, this little hamlet, we protect you. We don't leave you alone, okay? And it doesn't matter how many communists swing from tree to tree in the jungle, as long as they're not in your village killing your civilians, and as long as they don't prevent you from growing your rice. And that was the main issue, I think. And I have to tell you this, these liberal intellectuals, Mac George Bundy, all these people in Kennedy brought in and Johnson, they had no idea of warfare, they had no idea of Southeast Asia, they didn't know the difference between a Vietnamese, a Chinese, a Cambodian, or a Thai. But they had their ideas from their universities, you know.
I see.
They used to be called eggheads. Yeah.
A U.S. Marine major, I believe his name is Richard Botkin.
Yeah.
He has mentioned that most Americans don't know the exact truth of the Vietnam history or the details of the Vietnamese history. And even if they know, most of it would be incorrect or wrong. Well, how do we set the record straight?
Well, the record can only be set straight if people.
His point of view.
That's why I wrote this book, and why by others. There are other books out like that too. The record can only be set straight by having a museum. That's what you're doing. By the Vietnamese, who are a good community here, very respected in the United States as hardworking and clean and proper and incredible people. So by all that you can set it straight. But the destruction of the American media system in the 1960s, and I mean Walter Cronkite is still revered as the grandfather of American journalism. No, he wasn't. He was wrong.
Reading all your books, people would seem to see that you develop a love for the Vietnam.
Yes.
You have embraced the culture, the Vietnamese people. How did that? How did you develop that? Was it because you were a religious person, or did it come or stem from the images of the pain and the trauma that the Vietnamese people had gone through, and then you developed this love and compassion for our homeland?
Well, I had very, very good Vietnamese friends.
I see.
And I never managed it. With your multiple tone levels, it's very difficult for a European to learn your language. But in those days, French was still the lingua franca in Vietnam,
Yes.
and I speak French as well as English.
Beautiful
So
language.
that helps.
Yes.
I was included into social events by the Vietnamese society, French-speaking. But I mean, that even included people in little villages. I mean, every mayor or village chief or in somewhere in the hinterland of Vietnam spoke some French in those days. It helps. And then the German embassy, the West German embassy in Saigon, had many cultural events to which the Vietnamese attended. Concerts, theatre, but concerts in particular, which in return led to us taking a keener interest in Vietnamese culture. And it's fascinating, it's wonderful. I'm saying this to a beautiful lady. It's wonderful, I have wonderful memories of looking out of my hotel room in Saigon in the morning with all these beautiful women in their REIs floating down to the main drag at the former Uwe today it's called something else. It was so enchanting. It was enchanting to sit down with Vietnamese friends and discuss the difference in our culture, not in a superficial way, but really profoundly discuss these things and what we had in common, and listen to them. So I fell madly in love. I thought it was fantastic. I thought I found Vietnamese soldiers, some of the Vietnamese soldiers I went into combat with were, and so one develops an affinity. They are vulnerable, and it's not your job as a reporter to ridicule them, but it is to feel empathy for these people who didn't want this war themselves. It's not the South Vietnamese who started this war. It was the communists who started this war, and the reason was basically the Soviet Union more than China. And Ho Chi Minh was a part of the Soviet. He was, what most Americans don't realize, that Ho Chi Minh, even before World War II, was sent by the KGB, or by Comintern really, to China and Shanghai and then later closer to Vietnamese border, to destroy the Vietnamese nationalist movement from within, so that in the end the only opponents of the French in Vietnam were the communists.
The thing that I want to mention at this point is you are a witness of the Vietnam history. And in your opinion, what would be the best way to preserve this truthfulness or this truth about the Vietnamese history and keep it alive, especially for the future generations.
What you're doing, in a way, what I've been doing, what you're doing is very important. There should be good films about Vietnam. It is very important to point out that this was not a victory of a righteous cause, 1975, was a victory of a terrorist cause. That the Vietnamese people, I think it was a great shame. I'm saying it's not only about Vietnam but also about Germany, that the monarchy was abolished, because this sort of construction of a monarchy, of a powerful people, wherever you look in the world, the Vietnamese in Germany, they make wonderful citizens, Vietnamese refugees in West Germany. Wonderful citizens. They are become good writers, German writers, German doctors, dentists, all that. You have ambassadors for the traditional Vietnamese people in Germany, Austria, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and here in America. And they play a very important role in the general acceptance of Vietnamese history. So I mean, as long as you keep Vietnamese history alive in the minds of the younger generation here, you'll be fine. Communism is not going to last forever in Vietnam. And you notice that the South Vietnamese are doing very well. Obviously not because of communism, because at least in their economics, you can hardly call them communist anymore, but they are a vile dictatorship. That's another thing. That, you see, especially in the United States, you have to realize that many Americans don't think in historical terms, or of other nations in historical terms, you know? I mean, most Americans, or even those Vietnamese, those Americans who served in Vietnam, drove through Hai Ba Trung Street and don't know who Hai Ba Trung were, you know? It's very important. Those two sisters. This whole thing is not properly taught. The American soldiers who, like now in Afghanistan, they had no idea about Afghan history. And I don't think any American journalists had any idea about the American Afghan history. Same in Vietnam. We all had, at least the more educated of foreign correspondents, had Bernard Faw's wonderful book, The Two Vietnams on Our Bedside Table, which really gave you an insight into the history of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, Franco-Vietnamese relations, and of course American Vietnamese relations. You had to read this. If you don't read these things, then don't bother go to a country and behave like a yokel, you know. And don't dictate them what to do. You know, for example, I remember flying on an American aircraft, military aircraft, C-130, between an American GI and a South Vietnamese soldier. And the South Vietnamese soldier had a bird cage and a canary in the bird cage, and that was his only possession in his entire life. His entire family had been killed, you know, all of them. He had nobody left. He was on his way back to combat, the other guy. And because this guy spoke a little French, I could talk to him, and I explained to the American soldier about the life of this Vietnamese comrade there, the fighter. He said, why is he carrying this bird with him? It's his only friend, his only possession. He doesn't come out home, but then of course, Americans experienced pretty soon thereafter that they were bad-mouthed by their own civilian people when they came back here, you know, being called baby killers. I worked as a chaplain. This is in fact my report about this book called They Could Have Got the Theology of Vietnam for Vietnam Veterans. American GIs were badly treated, but at first they had no idea what the life was like. Very delicate matter to discuss. I often went to those Saigon tea bars, they were called, okay? All up and down Tuzo and the side street, there were bars. There were girls, they were not the most beautiful girls, and then they were bar girls and you could buy them. Nobody asked why they were sitting there. It's not because they found big GIs particularly beautiful, but they were widows of Vietnamese soldiers who had fallen in combat, and they didn't get any pension, and nobody looked after them, so ultimately they were forced. So you get a totally different outlook. They had no choice but to work in a Saigon bar.
To support themselves, to sustain themselves.
To feed their children. You know, these things, you cannot go into a country and then boom, 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 you know, and say, here we are, big boys, and then not learn anything about the Vietnamese culture, or even be disrespectful about them.
We talk about the characteristics of the Vietnamese people.
Sorry?
You talk about the characteristic of the Vietnamese people,
Yeah.
how beautiful they are. You also have mentioned some characteristic of the GIs, the Vietnamese soldier. But during the 1975 invasion of South Vietnam, of Saigon, the communists terrorized the Vietnamese certain people because these residents would not follow them or adhere to their policy.
Okay.
Now, is that me terrorizing people? Is that a particular characteristic of the communist guerrilla warfare?
It's part of a communist dictatorship. It's the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat. Don't think they were any better in Russia, or they were any better in China, or in East Germany. Well, East Germany, at least they didn't fight, but I mean, I was driven out of East Germany because I belonged to the wrong class. Look, you know what's happened in North Vietnam when Vietnam was divided. The land reform, the agricultural reform. What was it, 500,000 farmers killed? They are not Buddhists and they're not Christians. They are not. These are people who are ruthless killers. And this the Americans never understood this. They never reported what has happened in North Vietnam after Ho Chi Minh won the war against the French Dien Bien Phu. Again, many of them, one reason why the French lost that war was that the communists in France and the socialists in France didn't supply their troops or sabotaged the ammunition supply to their troops in Vietnam. There's a lot of very bad stuff going on in France, and here in America, the left-wing liberals, you know.
Let's talk about
the
American withdrawal from Vietnam.
Yeah.
Was it because of the war toll itself, the anti-war government movement, or the hypocrisy of the United States politicians pressuring the Congress to cut the aid, and then the result is the consequence is the fall of Saigon?
Well, we talked about that previously already. When the media portrayed South Vietnam as a corrupt country. There was a lot of corruption going on in South Vietnam. But talk about America, where 5 of the last 7 governors of Illinois are in jail for corruption. I mean, so they haven't had a war inside their country. Okay? So that's one of them. The elections, when were they? In 67 or 67 or 68, we had elections there, which the Viet Cong tried to torpedo. The guts the Vietnamese had to cover these elections. Okay, the guts they had to actually go to the polls, knowing that they would be killed by the Viet Cong on their way to the polling stations. You know, you had a democracy. Not everything was perfect. It wasn't Britain in the 19th century or something like that. This is in a war-torn country, and normally, here's an interesting thing. In the United Kingdom, during World War II, there were no elections. You had a coalition between Labour and Conservatives, because they had a common goal, which was to fight us, the Germans. Okay. Yet the Vietnamese, 80% of the South Vietnamese electorate participated in those last elections. I mean, I was flabbergasted. The guts they had, they actually went to the polls, and the parliament was a lively affair. I enjoyed going to the parliament. They beat each other up sometimes. It was marvelous, but it was good. It was a good part. You don't have a parliament like that in Hanoi, no. But this wasn't reported. It didn't seem. You know, when I came back to America after the Vietnam War, after having covered the Vietnam War, they said, "Well, you know, such a corrupt country. Why do we always link with corrupt people?" Most politicians have a corrupt side, and in most countries you have corrupt politicians. And America, first and foremost, you know. Sure, you had corrupt people, I don't know. Then you had authoritarian governments. You asked me about Modern Diem, but he wasn't. I don't think he was corrupt. He was a very patrician ruler. But they still had elections. So I don't know. It's just,
Did the American withdrawal result from the Western nations' inability to face a protracted war? Hence, they invented the so-called peace with honor, which President Nguyễn Văn Thiệu has called it peace of the Greeks.
Yeah, they cannot fight a protracted war because the people get bored with it. People don't want to, you know, 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Not nearly as many of the South Vietnamese, but anyway, they did die. And people came home wounded and crippled. And then suddenly they lost, why do we have this war? It came down to in effect, I spoke to many Americans. I was an American later as a foreign correspondent. Americans said, well, why would we have to sacrifice our young men for these corrupt South Vietnamese? That's not what you sacrifice your men for. You fought a hot phase of the Cold War, and the enemy was really Moscow. Okay? And why would you expect South Vietnam to be the perfect democracy if you yourself were the perfect democracy? And you know, all this made no sense. But they were not properly informed because they were let down by their media. And then, of course, the politicians, being mentally corrupted, like the ones, for example, who in 1973 denied arms to the South Vietnamese government, which in fact then led to the end of the downfall of Saigon. It was because the people, the population, popular vote did no longer support this war effort. They did in the beginning, and had this been properly presented to the American public as something that will come to haunt you when you lose, you know. And don't you think that Afghanistan now, the people of the Taliban in Afghanistan, that they have not learned their lesson from Punjab, you know, the Americans, you sit it out long enough, the Taliban or North Vietnamese, and the Americans will say, no, bring our soldiers home for Christmas. You know, and the next thing is cliche thinking. You're thinking in cliches. The cliche is we have to bring our homes back for boys back for Christmas, and our boy and all that sort of thing. And the next thing, and of course they're all corrupt, the South Vietnamese. And then in the end, they more or less celebrate. And you have the students, your college students in California. I've seen them here carrying posters, ho 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 Chi Minh, you know, without the foggiest idea Ho Chi Minh was, even though it was known. This marvelous professor, he was actually an Austrian Jew, French citizen, who then taught at Howard University in Washington DC, Bernard Ford, described all this in great detail. As I said, we all had this book, The Two Vietnams, on our bedside table. But you've got to read a book, otherwise don't bother reading a book and don't bother going there. Go to a hamburger joint somehow in the nearest village. But this was so ridiculous. That is what you are fighting against, and why it is so important to promote and work on the history of South Vietnam and on the history of all of Vietnam, and then a separate issue on how on Vietnamese communism.
During this time, the Vietnamese people have fought the war and also at the same time, simultaneously, trying to build the country economically, socially. What would you describe or point out some of the characteristics of the South Vietnamese during this period that oftentimes the media or the world ignore or make us make South Vietnam a victim of betrayal?
Yeah, it was a victim of betrayal, and I tell you, it was that part of the media. It was not all of the media. I have to repeat this often and often again. There were good stories. I think television was horrible here in America. I think the New York Times played a very dubious role, but you know, I covered this war with Bill Toohey, who was Los Angeles Times correspondent. He was a very fair writer, described the Vietnamese military. A lot of people in the Washington Post described it fairly. But then all this changed. The more the American media changed their character, and Vietnam became a victim of the change in journalistic professionalism in the United States and around the world. And it has cost the Americans a lot because, as I said, Afghanistan would not have been possible. This disgraceful withdrawal from Afghanistan now would not have been possible had it not been for the irresponsible change in the Vietnam War. When the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive, was won by the United States and South Vietnam and South Korea and the Australians and Filipinos. I mean, you had a lot of allies. This wouldn't have been possible. There would have been a totally different policy towards Afghanistan had they thought straight in Vietnam. You see, I mean, this is how history goes, especially in our era of communications, fast, instant communications. And you say, well, you could word for word, when I followed the developments in Afghanistan and compared them with the developments in Vietnam. Every word, you just had to exchange the words. You said Vietnam, you would have written Afghanistan. Corrupt government, corrupt regime. Our allies are not prepared to fight. No, they're not prepared to, they were prepared to fight. Till the very bitter end have they fought in the South Vietnamese. But then, of course, they had no guns. And they had no air support. So then what's the end of that?
We talk about the Tet Offensive in Hue, 1968. We talk about the withdrawal, the long withdrawal, and the victim of betrayal, the certain Vietnamese, the trauma, the suffering, the pain, and we talk about your book. Now, was there anything else that you would like to add so that your thoughts,
well,
experience?
one thing that applies to American public more than to the Vietnamese public, or listeners, and that is you've got to get your ducks in a row if you want to survive as a democracy, and you have to see that you cannot fall for your own propaganda. That's number one. The other one is that a nation with such a long and interesting history like Vietnam will ultimately fall on its feet again. Economically, Vietnam has already. You have faithful Vietnamese here in the United States and in Europe and Australia who can support it. It will take some time, but ultimately, unless you give up on your history, and if you give up on your history and the comfort you receive from the history that you have learned at school or on your father's lap, but if you want to give up on that, that would be dangerous. But you're not doing it. You're like this museum now. You're promoting the study of Vietnamese history, and the Americans are well advised to not view other nations as superficially as they have done. I mean, the Americans, I admire what the Americans have done in Europe, for example, immediately after World War II. I admire the sacrifices they made in Southeast Asia and Vietnam and Laos and elsewhere. But then you have to find, through social media and other means, ways of correcting false impressions given by bad journalism. Bad journalism, you have to train journalists properly, but you must train journalists so that even if it's unpleasant, they stick to the truth, they stick to research, they're neutral, and then let the readers decide what's right and what's wrong. You know, and this quote you quoted Roman and Jap. I think I changed the title of my book. Before it was called Duc, because I was a Duc. I was a German. I am a German. But what Jap wrote is, the enemy, meaning the West, does not possess the psychological or political means to fight a long drawn-out war. And probably the best Vietnam War correspondent was a colleague of mine, Adalbert Weinstein. He was a reserve general in the West German Army, Frankfurt Allgemeine. And here he summed up when Saigon fell: America could not wait. That's the key sentence. and it cannot wait unless they change their election cycles, so that people can actually do some serious thinking. Every 2 years you're campaigning. First year you learn the trade of being a representative, a congressman. The second year you're doing an election campaign. They can never focus long enough. You know, senators are a different kettle of fish, but this is the thing, and it has to be done. In the meantime, the South Vietnamese must. Those of you abroad, you're young enough, you must preserve the treasure of Vietnamese history. To vote, for example, trust me, share this off. You have to preserve your history. You have to promote your history. You have to make your various dynasties known to the general public, even to the young Vietnamese here. Mm-hmm. I mean, do they learn about the various Vietnamese dynasties in schools here? What about Vietnamese classes or temples or whatever? Right. This has to be taught. History is the most wonderful thing. And it defines a culture, and it defines a civilization. And if you lose your sense of history, you lose your sense of civilization, and ultimately we become uncivilized.
If you are given an opportunity to say 3 words, or say one thing about the Vietnam word, or the South Vietnamese people, here in America, what would that be?
Well, the South Vietnamese people were very strong, sturdy, charming people, attractive people. I found them interesting people, probably the most interesting, complicated. We are a complicated lot, and that's, by the way, that's one of their problems too. You have 3 Vietnamese in 5 different parties, you know. They squabble all the time because they're complicated, because they think. Confucianism, thinking, and so we fight each other. But it's interesting. They're not bores, they're interesting people. You have a wonderful cuisine, you have a wonderful old culture, you have a very wonderful philosophy. That has to be maintained, and you know, I would find it very sad if 2 generations from now Vietnamese Americans schlumphed about and looked fat from too many hamburgers, you know. That would be very, very sad. Your cultural institutions, your church congregations, your temple, Buddhist temple congregations, should teach these things, and befriend the Americans and show them, look, there's more to us than Nước Mắm and you know.
There's more than just áo dài, nước mắm, all of those, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate